Thanks for joining me. This is Jen again, coming to you with a watercolor lesson. This is going to be a very easy beginner watercolor lesson. You don't need a lot of expensive equipment to do it. You could probably even do it with a lot of the brushes that are around your house, but I will show you a couple of fancy ones to use if you're feeling particularly saucy. Now, they have lots of different kinds of watercolors and lots of different brands, but at DSI we use some of the pre-concentrated watercolors. I'm not the world's greatest fan of pre-concentrated for when you have become more developed, but when you're first starting out, you can use these no problem. Now, something you can also use around your house if you don't have any watercolors is something like food color. Now, when you mix some of these food colors together, sometimes depending on how the dye is made, they act a little wild. But it's still a good way to kind of start to play with color in a water kind of vehicle. So watercolors, true watercolors, are made of a couple different things like binders, which kind of keeps it together, plasticizers, which kind of make it kind of runny, but also kind of keep its shape, and humectants, which kind of keep it moisturized long enough so it doesn't dry up and stuff. So there's lots of other things that you won't have the luxury of if you use something like this, but when you're first starting out and if you just need something in a pinch to kind of experiment with, food dye is okay. Just be aware that food dye as well as watercolors will stain your hands, okay? And some will stain for maybe half a day to a day, some of them for like 3 or 4 days. So be careful with that. All right. Sorry, my cats are in the background and apparently they really want to get in on this video. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a larger brush, and it's just any kind of large brush that has a bend to it. Ideally, you're going to want a wash brush, but purchasing nice watercolor brushes can be expensive. So you can use something like this. If you have a big kid's brush around, something like this will work too. This is a Crayola So Big. We find these in a lot of households, and it's a big brush that can hold a lot of water or paint all at once. Okay, so any kind of brush that's larger. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to wet our paper, and just a little bit. We don't need a ton to begin with. Now, this is called pre-stretched paper, which means it's been dunked in the water and it's been flipped over and soaked a few times. And then what you do is you go ahead and press it between 2 paper towels. And what that does is take off the excess moisture, but still allow it to be used as a watercolor paper. And the reason we do that is because we don't want a lot of buckling to happen. Buckling is an issue where the paper starts to kind of go up like hills like this. And if you pre-stretch, which is just a fancy word for saying soaking your paper and letting it kind of expand a little bit, then it's not going to do that as much. At least it shouldn't. And then afterwards, what you're going to want to do is use any kind of Scotch tape you have around. I like, masking tape. I like the Scotch brand in particular, but there are other brands out here. Now, what I've done for this lesson is I've divided the paper into 2 sections because I like to have one area where, if I wanted to, I can make 2 different little paintings that kind of go together as a family. But for this, what we're going to do is we're going to use this side so you can see the colors that I'm mixing before we put them on, and the reason that we're doing it like we do it. So, going to go ahead and put water down and wash this section. I actually have this, and you can see here on an old tray, just an old lunch tray that's been pretty beat up here. And you can put your watercolors on anything that's plastic and just a little bit bigger than the size of the piece of paper that you're working on. So I'll be going ahead and getting some water. Now, since this is a very large brush, you're going to want to make sure to just get a little bit of it soaked inside there. So just a little bit like that. Okay, and we're just going to go straight up and down on top of our paper, and we're doing it in stripes that slightly overlap the last one. We want like a nice layer, and when you look at it, don't touch it, because when you do that, it pools water, and you're going to get, if you have anything on your fingers, see, I already have some paint from mixing some of the paints. You don't want to touch that and transfer it on there. Instead, what you do is you shift from side to side looking at your paper to see if it's wet. So what's going to happen next is we are going to go ahead and we are going to add some color to the background, and it's going to be a real gentle color. So what you want to do is you want to take out a brush like this. This is a filbert brush. If you have a filbert, great. If not, a flat brush will work, or even a round brush of any kind will work, okay? So we just want it to be a medium-sized brush. I'm going to stick with the filbert because I like the rounded edges on it. So back here, what we're going to do is we have to remember that trees are made up of a couple different things. They're kind of like a letter Y, think of them that way. They break off somewhere. Maybe you have one more little break off. And then on those branches, you have other branches that come off, and those make more V's and Y's. Okay? That's pretty much it for a tree. That's it. V's and Y's like that. And most trees are reaching upward because they are looking for sun. It's the saddest little sun I've ever seen. They also have a wider base, okay? Not literally like a letter A, like this, but we want to think of them as being more cone-like towards the bottom. Most of the time, some trees are very stick-like. But this is kind of the reason that we're going to be doing this break off for this next section. So you were using this little brush here and dragging it across to make V's and Y's. But if you're feeling particularly saucy, you can purchase yourself a liner brush. This is one of my favorite brushes to do this technique with, so I'm going to go ahead and drag through like this, and I'm twirling as I go. And this is a great brush because you can plant it and just gently wiggle wherever you want to get these very small little branches that come off. Now we don't need a billion of these. It's up to you whether you want to add these in at all. I usually do because I like the way it looks. So I'm going ahead and I'm pulling these a bunch of different spots like that. And you want to kind of drag it. This is a drag brush. Many brushes are drag brushes, not all of them. But you want to drag it across the surface like so. And we're going to make sure that when it comes off the base of the tree that it's not just a little stick, that it has some thickness to it. So make sure that you're keeping with this tree. Don't randomly add some to the other one. You'd have to wait for that color to kind of pop back in here. So adding it throughout like this. And at the bottom here, I like to add little kind of sticks that are kind of coming up, like smaller trees that are kind of, you know, growing up from the forest floor there. And notice how I'm holding it like a little teacup like this when I'm doing these lines, because what I'm really doing is I'm just dragging across the surface there. You don't want to press down like that very often unless you're trying to lay down a thick line. So going through like that, pulling here and there, like so. And as I go through, I'm making sure these lines are zigging and zagging. We don't want them to go up too high. That's kind of important. The next thing that we're going to be working on after this has fully dried is going to be dropping in some of these cool little leaves. Now, when we drop in these leaves, they're going to be pretty loose in some areas and a little tighter in others. So what you'd really want is any kind of brush that is a little more round. If you have a round brush like this is literally a Crayola brush. So if you have some kid sets sitting around, rounded brush is literally looks like a tube, and then at the top is rounded off, this type of round brush. So it's good at dropping in some water, but not too much. But you can also use any kind of brush that you have around that'll hold a little bit of paint and some water. That's fine too. I'm actually going to go ahead and use a combination of both just so you can see. And the first thing we're going to do is we're finally going to use some of this clean water that we've been having sitting over here saying, hey man, what about me? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get some water on here. Make sure you don't drip all over the place. If you do, it's not the end of the world. And we're going to come up here and we're going to add little blops of water. So hopefully you can see that on the screen. And we want some of them to be kind of a big blob, and we want some of them to be individual little areas like this. And they're just going to sit right there in between some of the branches to start out with. We'll add some on top of the branches. We don't want to do that thing where we pretend we have a magical force field around branches. will start out kind of like that. So it's sitting there, it's starting to soak into the paper a little bit. We don't want it to sit too long. Actually adding almost little drops like beads of water on there. Now that it's kind of sat for a while and it's been stretched, it'll be a lot easier for this to actually kind of sit there by itself. So this drop-in method is pretty cool. It allows the watercolor, like we said before, to do a lot of the hard work for you. And it does some really beautiful things on its own, kind of takes some of the chaos that's in the paper and then does it. So I'm going to go ahead and speed this along in just a second. And then you can go ahead and follow along after this part. So go ahead and watch the time lapse of this happening. Let me adding on here. I'm going to go straight on over to my bright yellow color, any kind of yellow that you have. And you want to make sure it's dulled down a little bit, not too pasty. The consistency should be that it kind of is watery and ends up kind of spreading out. And then I am going to add some of that in. And then some of these I'm going to put it in and I'm going to drag in a different direction like this. Make sure that you're adding a nice saturated bit from the bottom like this. There. Adding some throughout here like this. I like to kind of connect some of these little blobs here so they're not living their own little lonely life. They're going to feel like part of the forest. Adding them in like this, like so. Don't worry if you yellow in the tree like I did there. We're going to add some of those in anyway. Going through, making sure to add a nice consistent amount of that in different spots. And then you can start adding a little bit into some of these areas that crisscross our branches like this. Maybe bring it a little bit across like that. And it's okay if it's gonna kind of destroy a little bit of the edge of that branch. That's good. We like that. That is not a bad thing, as long as it's not all of your tree. You want some of it to be distorted by leaves. So I'm gonna go ahead and watch you time lapse this area here. So go ahead and watch this and then paint along in just a moment. Count down to 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so now that I've kind of time lapsed this and you can see how it's kind of dropped in there kind of randomly, there's a couple different ways we can handle this. Okay, so we can let this sit here and dry, and when it dries it'll give like this really deep kind of patchy, swirly, interesting pattern, and then we'll add our last like little layer on top of it, our sub layer. And the other thing that you can do, you can also try this and see how you like it. You take a piece of paper, doesn't have to be a lot of it, kind of ball it up like this and go over into the area that you like there. The only problem with this is that if it hasn't sat for a long enough time, that pigment, the second color we put in, the red, won't really get in there. So I'll show you what I mean. Won't be as bright. See? It's pretty cool. You can see a little bit of it. Now you can see here after the time lapse, these different areas that are like real golden and have kind of eaten through some of the tree background. So this is kind of a fun technique to kind of use what you already have and add an overlay with it without having to go back and think too hard about spacing and stuff like that. But this only really works if you have like a very golden base, remember, because this is kind of like what I call knockout color. So what we're going to do is our last thing here, and that was, I did the pressing method. So right now the paper's pretty moist, which is okay because I don't want my flowers, or I'm sorry, my leaves to look too crisp. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to use my flat brush. Any little old flat brush will do. And I'm going to go over and I'm going to go into my orangey red color here. And I'm going to get a pretty decent amount on my brush like this, just straight up. You can see what it looks like over there. So it's kind of an orangey red. And you get that literally by mixing some of the yellow into your red. And all I'm going to do over here is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to flip and flop my brush here and there like this. Find a couple little spots and then flip and flop your brush around like so. If you're a fan of the stamping method, you can stamp right after this if you don't want the color to be too bright, or if you want to really build up some layers. You can do it kind of easily here. I'm a fan of that stamping method, as you've seen. And you don't have to keep it in just those areas. You can leave some areas more kind of golden like that. Doesn't mean you have to have a certain ratio. Don't think too hard about it. Just flip it around here and there like so, plunking down like that. And then as before, when you do this, you're going to want to go ahead and do the stamping or the just kind of letting it lay down method. I'm also going to add in some of this more fuchsia-ish color. It's not quite red, but more fuchsia, just to give a little pop of color here and there. It's a little bit different. I'm going to do the same thing, but just a little bit here and there, not much. Okay, and so this part here, after you've seen the time lapse and some of the stamping and some of the add-ons, the last thing you can do, if you want to, you don't have to do this at all. It actually requires some acrylic paint of any kind. And all you're going to do is take a teensy bit of your acrylic paint. I mean, real little. You don't need a lot at all, about that much. And what you're going to do is you're going to use your liner brush here. And you are going to add just a tiny bit of yellow to the side and a tiny bit of orange or red, whichever you prefer, to the side. You're going to want to go ahead and get one of your flat brushes or any of the other brushes that you can kind of add a little bit of water to this with. So we want water added to it. We want to get the rest of it off there. Whoops. Or, you know, make a mess on your table, that's fine too. So you're going to go ahead and mix this together there like that. So you're mixing some of the watercolor in with the acrylic. Same thing over here, we're going to warm it up a little bit, adding that in there. So you have kind of a lighter brown color by the time you're done, but it has, it's thicker, it's more opaque. You can't see through it. And then all we're going to do is we're going to take our liner brush, okay, and we're going to drag through. And you want to find some of the areas that are already a little bit bright, and you want to gently tap in on some of the branches here, especially the ones that do crisscrosses. You want to gently tap in some of the brightness there. And all this is going to do is help make sure that you have some differentiation between different branches that are going on there. And is it 100% necessary? No, definitely not. but I just kind of like the way that it looks. And it's a simple thing to do. You can even add like little stripey guys like that. That looks pretty cool. Like so. And it's going to be real subtle when it dries. It's just going to be enough that you'll notice like that there's some variation and some brightness there. That's helpful. And I'm actually going to even do that on the tree up here. I'm just making stripes. And you can do this if you have a watercolor that's actually white. A lot of watercolor sets come with a white, and it kind of is more opaque. But I kind of like to do this because I can control the amount of opaqueness. All right, and then you can build on top of that, like so. You can even pop a couple back there on your little branches. Okay, and that's it. That's all you have to do. That's your watercolor. It's simple. Once you get this down, you can use this technique for a lot of different things when you're doing paintings in watercolor, and you can keep your trees thicker or thinner, whichever you want. As you can see here, two variations on the same kind of idea. This one being warmer, this one being kind of a little more sparkly, with the trees being a little on the cooler side. So this one's a little more monochrome, this one's a little more varied. Okay, that's up to you how you want to use your color palette. Some people even like to do this in blues. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you for our next lesson soon.